Well, look who's shown up. We're at handover time down here in Australia to my two very good colleagues and friends, Jane Lewis and Dr. Bianca Albers, which just rolls off the tongue so nicely. So we are transitioning now between the Australian / Singapore friendly time zone into the UK, but please, people, stay with us. And they've got a terrific program going up into the middle of the night. And of course, everything has been recorded. And I'm pretty sure today's content won't be long for getting online. It came online quite quickly last night. So what we'd like to do as we set ourselves up for our next keynote is hear a little bit about the highlights overnight that I missed while I was trying to sleep, takeaways, things that the two of you really enjoyed. I will also share with you highlights of our day today, and then Bianca, we will hand to you to chair our next keynote session. But Jane, you want to have a little summary first?
Yes, I will do, yes. And I caught the last two keynotes as well, which were both of them just absolutely terrific, and so much energy, even over the ether. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for setting up today so brilliantly for us. I mean, we had an amazing day yesterday. It was just fabulous. The first thing that we had after our handover was Ruth Stewart from the Africa Evidence Network and University of Johannesburg, talking about the work that she and others have been doing in South Africa to bring together evidence and policy making. And she just spoke in such a wonderfully, really visionary way. She had this really nice thing that she said all the way through: it's not okay. Poverty is not okay. Inequality is not okay. Telling single stories about policy or about evidence is not okay. Sidelining policymakers is not okay. And she described the framework that they use now in South African policymaking, which requires policymakers to really demonstrate how they've used the evidence. One of the things I particularly liked about it was that it required people to articulate what had been tried so far and why it hadn't worked. And that just seems so important to me. You know, we have this constant sort of reinvention of the wheel, and that felt like a really powerful way of addressing that. So it was just absolutely, really, really terrific. Then we moved into panels and discussion groups. I mean, Twitter was just on fire at that point. You know, you kind of felt like a kiddie in a candy store, not knowing quite where to look and what to choose. But, you know, as we keep saying, it's all online and all there for us to listen to. So I caught a great panel on rapid cycle design and testing, which really demonstrated how voluntary sector organisation had turned into data nerds and used data for improvement and really absorbed it into understanding their own practice and the programme as a whole. And then we had a second round of panels and discussions, loads of really super stuff on building evidence using cultures and so on. A really nice looking one on contextualization and transportability that I've earmarked to listen back to. And then before I move on to highlights from the afternoon, Bianca, what do you want to throw in in terms of your highlights?
Oh, I think all things evidence-based policymaking yesterday. There were some really cutting-edge messages and debates. One coming from John Thwaites from Australia, very nice back and forth between him and you, Robin, about how can we at all make it possible to use my evidence in policymaking, and under what conditions might we be able to do that? And him basically saying, okay, researchers, you need to get your hands dirty. It may be a messy thing. You may risk something, but politicians risk something as well. So get in there and make it possible together with us. I think that was quite a strong message. And then moving into that panel where Annette Boas from the UK delivered some like 5 provocations that were discussed by a great panel from the UK. I think these two things really nicely aligned with each other and put policy at the center of this event as well. I really liked that a lot.
And it's great as well to see how well represented policymakers are in the audience attending over the last couple of days, and in the folks registered. It's sort of more so than I was expecting. Our registrants are not as heavily oriented to researchers as I was expecting, and that's just really terrific to see, in a real mark of the way the movement is going forward. And yeah, the panel on evidence and policy that we had first thing in the UK Europe time afternoon was just absolutely terrific. We had Professor Annette Bowers from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Professor Becky Francis, who's the Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, the leading What Works Centre on education in the UK with a global presence, and Chris Webber from the Open Innovation team in Westminster Government, which is this really, really interesting setup that engages with academics and other folks in the design and development of policy, and does just really inspiring, very kind of ideas oriented work. And I mean, the message I took most strongly from that was, government's actually in pretty good shape in the UK in terms of its approaches to evidence. It really, really wants it. It's got strong incentives to use it. Chris talked about good advice being, the key thing for civil servants that gets you up the career track, and the importance that, the expectation that evidence will be part of what makes good advice. And, all the incentives are there really in government. There's a lot of time invested in building relationships. Chris was saying that they sometimes struggle to find the researchers that they want to find, and to get those researchers to put the time into building relationships with them that civil servants invest in building relationships with evidence. So, a real message that, the academy actually is the bit of the system that needs to sort of get its act together. Annette really reflected that as well, and talked a bit about how academia needs to sort of change and develop. All three of them have these really interesting boundary spanning roles. They've all hopped between evidence and policy and practice in their own work, and that came out very strongly, and they really reinforced the need for brokerage and intermediary roles. And Becky Francis had a very nice summary of what that knowledge broking involves, which was relationships, environment, solutions, we've got to stop doing stuff that isn't working as well and make space for the stuff that is working, and timely, the importance of that really, really timely work. So that was just terrific. Bianca, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think you summarized that nicely, and it's interesting that the focus was so much on, in both of these, John Thwaites and this one, on, okay, researchers, what are you going to do to make your work more accessible? Are you really doing the hardest you can? That was interesting.
Yeah, I think from both of those sessions, and from the other ones as well, you got a real sense of the world shifting from pushing research to people in a kind of why aren't they using it, to pull, policymakers just really reaching out for evidence. And then Mary Dixon Woods from the Healthcare Improvement Science Institute in the UK just did an absolutely awesome.
I could see on Twitter she was popular.
Yeah, her slides were so absolutely fantastic and so legion that they blew the system. Just at the very end, we didn't get to see the last 2 or 3, but I think that would have been for when it went online. But I mean, she was just absolutely wonderful, and she talked in such an illuminating and insightful way about quality improvement. She had this lovely story about the importance of theory in quality improvement that she illustrated by talking about an initiative led by her daughter to stop squirrels eating the bird food, and how together in her family they examined the theory behind it, they questioned it and tested it, they redeveloped the theory, and they developed alternative solutions. So there's a lot of science going down around the breakfast table in that family. But she was just absolutely wonderful, and talked about the fact that actually, we really don't know whether quality improvement actually improves quality. We don't nearly as much as we need to know about when it does and when it doesn't. She had some terrific examples of unintended consequences and things that just hadn't worked or had gone badly wrong. And she really emphasized the need for soft intelligence and for deep listening, the importance of multiple perspectives and multiple forms of evidence to understand what the data is telling us. It was terrific, really great.
Oh, wow. Well, it was nice to wake up to that, that's for sure. And I was quickly trying to catch up on all the social media channels. And I will say one highlight of our day today is one of the Centre for Evidence Implementation staff who, just before this conference, didn't have a Twitter account and didn't know how to Twitter. He's actually been locked out of Twitter because of how prolific he's been and Twitter being suspicious that something's up. So I am going to claim that win of the conference for Surin. I need to... But today, let me. So I have the advantage of I've had some people, very kind people who we work with, summarize for me just because I've been chairing various keynotes. But we started the morning with Jenny Donovan, who's setting up what is essentially the equivalent of the Evidence Endowment Foundation here. I would say a different, broader approach to evidence for sure. They published the standards of evidence already. It's worth looking on the website. She made some really, takeaway comments. Research and evidence will not improve any student outcomes if it sits on a website. Boom. But wanting to be evidence-informed and knowing how to be evidence-informed are two different things. My summary of listening to Jenny talk this morning was they are taking a very strong partnership approach with schools, kind of a ground-up use of evidence, maybe rather than what could be perceived as a top-down. And quite interested in studying the use of research use, which is a little bit of a different discipline to implementation science around the actual action of that. And we had a bit of back and forth on that in the keynote, which was interesting, but she was terrific. And then we went straight into Ruth Levine, who, if you just need to watch something to remember why we do what we do, we just need to watch the 20 minutes of Ruth's keynote. She is such a passionate, it was almost a moral obligation. You want to be a better person listening to her. She doesn't claim anything that she doesn't already know or hasn't had any experience with. The audience were looking for quite kind of concrete examples from her around where has co-creation been done well. How do you know when you have trust? So it's a lot of the stuff, Bianca, you've been writing about with Alison Metz and other colleagues. And she's all there, but when push came to shove, her and I had a really hard time going, when has that happened? When have we lost trust and tried to get trust back? When do you know you have trust? What does it mean, and what does it mean for outcomes? And so Ruth is a well worth people's time, and over again to remember why we're all here doing what we do.
It's also it's interesting to hear that this trust relationship thing is so present at the moment. I find it a lot on Twitter. There's a growing focus on it.
I think it's because I was trying to get at it with Sandy's keynote before. Although Centre for Evidence Implementation is part of this attempt to reform service, at the end of the day, there are unequal relationships going on in there, and everybody knows it. And there's, even with the service, like it is, I can see why it's become a bit of a thing. I think the challenge is, Bianca, isn't it, to make it concrete and actionable. And even Ruth was saying, I'm not sure even how to do that. I will say the discussions are really full. They are going off. All of our facilitators have been a bit thrown about how many people they have coming to them, so it's kind of well worth probably going into them. We had a number of panels around some work that we're doing here around service reform, building partnerships around education in Northern Territory. Thanks to some Twitter input and some acknowledgement by the panel, our previous work around education and implementation was highlighted in a few panels. So it's been just a terrific day. And then, of course, you saw David as we started to come in, and just as almost humble and just, isn't it obvious we should be doing this approach to evidence and trialing? It was like, duh, why wouldn't you do it? And then Sandy, the incoming secretary, a public policy person in a new role. So it is going to be a terrific day and a lot of content available for over the year. I want to do some thank yous in the last 3 minutes we have, because this conference isn't ending here, but because I'm handing over. And I have somebody who spent 2 days in the studio with me. I will say that some people thought that I had put blue velvet curtains up in our house, and I was speaking from there. And just so we're clear, I'm in a studio. But I have a gift, and I have someone who's going to walk into frame. So we would normally be doing this live and giving her flowers. We can't. The lovely Nikki Abercrombie, here she is. She can't hear. We're clapping, 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 clapping. Your work, my goodness, this wouldn't exist. Nikki has done work with us across all 5 conferences. She is delight. She's put up with all of my rubbish the last couple of days. And Event Frog, Vanessa and the team at Event Frog, we also want to thank. They have just been terrific. We have had so many comments about how professional this is, how seamless this is, how great it looks, how Nikki tried to get me to wear white 2 days in a row. So we're taking her out for dinner now. That's our transition. And I want to thank all of the people that have been, jumping on Twitter and getting on the panels and asking great questions, all of the Centre for Evidence Implementation staff, the people that Bianca, Jane and I get to work with have just been so terrific, right down to people's Twitter accounts being closed, which just is the best. And then we get to have a little bit of a rest and wake up tomorrow and watch what highlights. So just very quickly, Jane, a couple of highlights you've got coming up now in your day.
Yep, so next up, and Bianca will be sharing it, is Professor Sue Dopson from the Saïd Business School on leadership. And I'm sure we'll follow up on issues you've been raising, Robin, about women in leadership. Then we've got a break, and then we've got what will be a fabulous keynote from Professor Bruce Chorpeter on common elements, which, just absolutely wonderful to have him. And then we'll follow up with that with a panel from 4 different people speaking from different perspectives on common elements. So we've got Professor Bryce McLeod from Virginia Commonwealth, Dr. Patty Lighton, Dr. Alicia Clark, and me talking to our CEI work on common elements. So that will be an opportunity to drill down in a bit more detail into what it looks like in practice. So all the makings of a really excellent day coming up. We're really pumped for it.
Well, that's terrific. So Bianca, we're actually going to leave you in a virtual sense, in that we are shoved out of here, you are left, and then your person joins you. So thank you, Brisbane. So I've had some young men in Brisbane in my ear for 2 days playing the most appalling music in between things that I've been trying to give them tips to improve it, but no one's listening to me.
It wasn't so bad yesterday.
You were sick, remember? All right. Night.
Is there another song out there? Is there another somewhere out there? If you can hear me, let me know. Need your strength to let you go. Give me shelter, give me all. 'Cause I lost myself now. I've been right more than I've been wrong, and I swear I've seen it all. In the dead of night, like a faded light, she's gone. Is there another you somewhere? Is there another you somewhere? Is there another you somewhere out there? Is there another you somewhere out there? You somewhere out there?
Hello. Welcome. Sue, it's a pleasure to see your face on the screen. And,
Thank you.
as you may know, as you may remember, I've tried to invite you as a keynote to different conferences I've been involved in multiple times. And for some weird reason, unfortunately, our calendars never aligned. And this time we were lucky, extremely lucky. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to the EIS audience because you are a capacity in my eyes. You are a professor of organizational behavior and deputy dean at Saïd Business School at Oxford University, also a fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford. You are a social scientist, have a background in sociology, which I find extremely helpful and interesting. You've done tremendous work at the intersection of evidence-informed innovation, transformational change, and leadership in healthcare services. Among others, you have helped UK health services to better understand the barriers and facilitators to spreading and utilizing research findings in practice, and have influenced how healthcare practitioners and leaders are trained and prepared in the UK. That's impact. I think another interesting and important part of your work is creating better leadership coaching to help healthcare leaders become better leaders, where you chair the coaching committee at Saïd Business School, and you work with colleagues to develop a bit of an Oxford style of coaching. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of this transpire in your presentation here with the intriguing title, Why is Change So Difficult in Healthcare Settings? Full stop, not a question mark, a full stop. Again, it's a great pleasure to have you. Please, Sue, take it away. The word is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure to be at this conference. It's such an important community of practice. As you've already mentioned, I've spent many, many years studying change in complex settings like healthcare. I've been looking at the challenges of getting clinical evidence and also management ideas into practice. But I really want to reflect on the role of leadership in implementation. And I'm going to argue that as researchers, we need to be much more curious about the context in which leaders are trying to get evidence into practice. So I've set out the talk, and we'll have lots of chance to have conversation and questions later. I want to present first a very mini case study, which is one of many case studies that I've been involved in, and you will have been involved in, where you begin to see the complexity of the challenge of getting good ideas into practice. And then I want to just reflect a little bit on leadership theory. It's something that I teach at the business school. It's something I'm passionate about. It's changing, and I think we need to really understand as researchers in this field how leadership practice is changing, because I think we need to really begin to engage more with leadership work in our research and attempts to change policy. So let me start then by sharing this case study with you. And this is a case study done in the UK not many years ago, but a few years ago, where essentially the flavor of the month, and I don't want to be disparaging about that, was genetics research, getting genetics into practice. And there was a big discussion in government about universities and healthcare trusts, hospitals working together collectively on projects, so we better understood how genetics knowledge got into practice. And if I begin to look at, how this idea of creating 5 or 6 genetics knowledge park within the UK, where simply universities and healthcare settings could work together. And I interviewed a policymaker, and you were talking earlier about policymakers. I was listening in for the last half an hour. And typically this is a story of many of the projects that I've been involved in, where policymakers have a good idea and they throw it out to the system, and they expect the system to kind of deal with it. So this idea of a genetics knowledge park, when you talk to a civil servant, as I did, and this is the quote, the idea appeared very late in the drafting of the NHS plan, virtually just a sentence, just a throwaway sentence that took everyone by surprise. And then when the health secretary was questioned what it was, he said, "You tell me," and then we had to develop some themes. So you begin to see, from a kind of management of change perspective, that very often leaders and researchers in healthcare settings and university settings are often faced with receiving funding where there's a lot of uncertainty about what it is that we should do. And that creates a real challenge. And in my work, in our work, we began to map some of the kind of stakeholders involved in creating a genetics knowledge park where the university and the hospital work together. And I want to make the point here about the importance of us as researchers in this field of implementation, trying to get evidence-based practice and policy, the importance of really being curious about context. And this is a relatively complicated context, but I suspect you're working in similar types of areas. But it was only by understanding this context that you can begin to understand the story of what actually happened. And so we got the Department of Health, who really didn't know what they were doing in relation to this development. We've got the Department of Trade and Industry, who were brought in because they've got some money left in their budget and they didn't really know how to spend it. That's an important, uncertain context to understand. And then we have the university and various professors. We have the labs, because in genetics, the laboratories are very crucial. And of course, in the UK, as in many other countries, social scientists are being invited into this kind of arena, often a bit reluctantly, a bit suspiciously, but they're invited in this kind of arena. So you have this really interesting, complicated context where the leadership of this particular initiative, which was to get great genetic science into practice, you've got the leadership having to deal with this variety of stakeholders. And it's very important, I think, to really map that. So when you begin to look at what happened in this story, very importantly, you have to highlight the importance of subcultures or community affiliations, communities of practice, however we want to describe them. And it matters a lot where these groups are based, what incentivizes them, who pays them, how they're measured, and it matters how they're trained and the kind of language that they are used to using and how they evaluate what evidence is that would make them shift their practice. So in this story, you've got medical scientists in the university, so they're interested in careers with academic publications. You've got NHS medical scientists who are really focused on practice. You've got research scientists, again, who have to make their careers in relation to publications, although they're trained in biomedicine. And you've got NHS scientists, largely in the labs, who are doing very detailed, thoughtful, careful work, and not at all interested in publications, etc. So those communities, affiliations, it's important to really begin to understand where they're coming from, what shaped the way they think about the problem that we're trying to solve and what incentivizes them. And the story unfolds, well, I'll spare you the details, but essentially you've got the story, and we studied this over 5 years, of lots and lots of clashes. You have clashes because the Department of Health, after 3 years, suddenly kind of realizes that they ought to measure what's going on. So we have a cascade of measurement systems, please tell us what's going on, when they've been left alone for a period of time. We have clashes in relation to the commissioning, the purchase of these tests. So there were genetic tests that were actually converted in this particular story. And of course, none of the scientists or the excitement of generating this test and doing the research, etc., nobody had thought to engage with the people who eventually would have to buy it until right at the end. So clash. And I've just pulled out a couple of quotes here. There's a very interesting clash that we saw between the research and the NHS biomedical colleagues in this story, some of whom, as I already mentioned, make their careers in terms of publications, and some of whom make their careers in terms of just doing very safe work. And so you begin to see how a clash here, even though they share the same training, biomedicine, they speak the same language, but you see here the roles of incentives. The way we work in the research lab is try and get everything as fast as possible. It's competitive. We have to scrape over the surface for the prize. The prize for publication, the prize to make sure we have a job. Whereas their laboratory colleagues were compulsive and obsessive and never get anything wrong. It just takes too long for our world. And again, the NHS scientists feel they're providing a service and being careful, and we, the research scientists, are feckless people who wander in at 11 o'clock and go home at 3 and look for glory. So you begin to see a sense of these clashes, which are fundamentally partly driven by incentives. And social scientists. I was one of the people dragged into this particular story in terms of doing research. Colleagues in social sciences were also the economist and a sociologist. And what was interesting was the way in which the economist was able to navigate that complexity, because she had quantitative data, she had the communication skills in relation to the world in which the scientists felt comfortable. Whereas the sociologist, and this wasn't me, but it could have been me, work was weird and of no benefit. Our world is very black and white, so when a sociologist talks to me about barriers, it doesn't mean much more to me, these weird sort of sociology people. So if we go back, this sort of clash here is a remarkable sort of story. And imagine the challenge of leading something as complicated as this, where there is such a sense of wanting to work together because we want to get genetic science into practice. Everybody agrees with that goal, but something really gets in the way. And that was a very grand approach to managing change. So in my work over many years, I think that one thing that we need to be very mindful of is that when we think about organizations and contexts, such as the ones that we study, there's a dominant narrative that organizations are things and processes where individuals make choices, they're wise, decisive, heroic leaders, there's rational ways of doing things, and results come from choices. Whereas what we mostly experience, and this is not my work, it's Ralph Stacey's work, what we most experience is organizations as conversations, that we are interdependent. And I hope that very mini case study that I showcase there illustrates that interdependence. And we're almost entangled. We're entangled not just in a kind of incentive way, but in an emotional way. And no one can control what anyone else is doing and choosing to do. And far from being rational, people are quite emotional, as you know, and we're dealing with uncertainty. And the results emerge very often from an interplay of those stakeholders in both intended and unintended ways. So I think that's really an important sort of point I want to make, is that we need to conceive of the organizational context in which we work and we study in this way. And for leaders, increasingly, they are accountable, but they certainly are not in control. And what that means is that there needs to be very different approaches of leading complex change, like getting research into practice, like getting evidence into practice. And when I think about leadership, and I teach this stuff to MBAs and etc. And we talk about the difference between management and leadership. And my argument here is that when you're managing, you're really working in the area of the known, where you're right, you feel in control, you're almost the expert, and it's comfortable. But actually, when you're leading, you are absolutely stepping into a swamp, an uncertain swamp where it's chaotic, it's about relationships, emotions, ambiguity, and feelings. And increasingly, I think this is the case of leadership work, particularly in the kind of healthcare and policy settings that we explore. And if you look at leadership theory, it's changed. It's changed a lot. Classical leadership theory is very much around, you're a leader by virtue of where you are in the hierarchy. You're evaluated by if you solve problems, you provide solutions, etc. But increasingly, as leadership theory has caught up with the complexity of the worlds in which we work and you research and work, there's this notion of distributed leadership that has really taken hold. Leadership is evaluated by how people are working together. And one of the lessons in the Genetics Knowledge Park story was that we didn't see that distributed leadership. We saw a classical leadership approach by government, by those very heroic people who were trying to lead that complexity. And they were working in that kind of classical leadership model rather in this more distributed leadership model, where the communication is important, but one really needs to understand the participation. And in some ways, there are many definitions of leadership. My favorite, by the way, our definition of leadership is disappointing people at a rate that they and you can cope with, because there is such expectations on leaders, whether you're leading a research team, whether you're leading a healthcare setting that we're talking about here, that it's a tough, lonely job where disappointment becomes, I think, quite a feature. And one of the things that I have noticed over many years is that where leaders get into trouble in terms of managing change is often not spending enough time beginning to understand the problem that you are trying to solve. What is the work? What is the work of leadership? And if we begin to break down what leadership really is in terms of what problems you seek to address, there are largely three types of buckets of problems that leaders have to address. So sometimes it is the case that the leadership work indeed involves providing the answer, where you use your authority and hard power, if you like, to provide the answer. And in that moment, the kind of old style, tell it, this is what we're going to do, works. And sometimes we're faced with a more complicated puzzle where probably somebody somewhere has solved the puzzle or solved the challenge. And in that moment, then your job is to almost manage, organize processes, go out and find what's been going on really well in X setting and bring it back to your setting and nuance that with culture, etc., etc. But we are faced very often, and I think the work that colleagues on this conference do is largely in this very challenging, what Keith Brink calls wicked problems or adaptive challenges, where the answer isn't at all obvious, where the job of leadership is to create a context where conversations happen that wouldn't normally happen, where we almost have this kind of coaching approach of asking questions and employing sort of soft power, trust, etc. So if we look back at the Genetics Knowledge Park, we see, I think, a blend of command. This is what we're going to do. Learning from other settings, but what we don't see is a real understanding of the complexity of the challenge in which that leadership work was supposed to address. So with the command type style, managing change often comes to a very famous model of Lewin and Cotter, where, if you're faced with a relatively clear challenge, then, the old ways are not bad at all. The notion of top-down change, where you need to unfreeze, you need to get movement, you need to refreeze. And you have to establish a sense of urgency, form a sensible team, have a vision, communicate, etc. Short-term wins, make sure you're building something that really is sustainable. So when you're faced with, the kind of critical problem where you're clear about what needs to be done, that approach is great. Okay, that's great. But actually, if you're focusing more on these wicked or adaptive challenges, complex problems like getting research into practice in complicated settings, then you need to think about the leader, the context, and who it is that we're trying to influence. The Genetics Knowledge Park communities of practice required different strategies because the groups were different. And we need to be very attentive to context when we're thinking about complicated change and implementation challenges in complex setting like we work. And this is a very helpful diagram, I think, because it allows us researchers to think about what is context? What's going on here in relation to context? And if we think about this, the notion of power, what's the power dynamics in relation to this particular change? What's going in there that might help us understand why implementation is difficult or not? What's the unit of time? What's the scope? What is it that we really need to try and preserve that's working? So often I work in research projects and change projects where people forget that stuff works, and let's keep things, let's preserve what works. This point about diversity, the landing of different messages, people perceive things in different ways. What capability have you got? And what are the capacity? What's the real change capacity that you've got there? What's the resource? And what is this notion of readiness? So in leadership theory, we've seen a move from fix yourself as the leader, fix your followers, to a more intriguing debate, I think, about how can you as a leader nudge the context in order for leadership work and change work to happen. And you have this wonderful analogy of leaders are a bit like farmers. Farmers don't grow crops, but they do create the conditions for crops to grow. So this lens on leadership begins to get us to think as researchers and as leaders in these change environments, what aspects of the context do we need to nudge in order for things to flow? And that requires more adaptive leadership. So we may be faced with a technical challenge, which is a simpler change engagement, but we're often, in the worlds in which we're exploring at this conference, faced, I think, with adaptive challenges, where the leadership work here is to understand the context and its complexity in the way that I tried to map out the Genetics Knowledge Park context, but also then to try and set it, to try and move it. And Heifetz, who talks a lot about adaptive leadership, argues that we as leaders, and I would also argue researchers, need to get on the balcony, by which he means find a place where you can see patterns that are going on in the organizational context. And he talks about the dance floor. You know, what's going on in the dance floor, which is really the empirical sites in which we are researching and we're seeking to influence. And so that balcony dance floor, which of course, you know, is just great research. You know, good social science do that. But it's this notion of looking for patterns and making sense of those patterns. And then leadership work is also about describing a view of the future. And in this model of leadership, you give the work to the people who can help you solve the problem. So again, the genetics knowledge part, it should not have been a small group, I'm afraid, of the great and good, largely very, very distinguished academic professors, etc. But what it should have been is more collaborative work to try and solve this problem with people who are actually doing the work. And this idea of encouragement and coaching and challenge, you'll see the leadership work that coaching as a leadership practice is becoming much more of an issue. So I'm going to stop screen sharing there. So just some thoughts there. I don't know if these musings resonate. I'm interested in your views about what leadership practices you've seen facilitate implementation and evidence into practice. I'm interested about how our community of researchers think about leadership. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm very happy to take questions. I hope I've kept to time, Bianca. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I have multiple pieces of paper in front of me with multiple notes. Thank you so much, Sue. I want to encourage everyone, send in your questions, use the Q&A stream on your portal, or put in discussion contributions. And while this pops in, I have a few things myself I want to begin with. And it relates to different aspects of what you said. There was a slight provocation for me in what you presented, Sue, in that one could get an impression that you're kind of saying the managers, they have the easy job here. The leaders are in the swampy grounds, and we all know how squeezed managers can be in all of this, because they need to kind of maintain control over the old while also picking up all the new stuff. And they will be the persons who are constantly unpopular in organizations. So that was one of my observations. And probably let's begin there, and then I have other things that
I completely agree. I mean, it's an academic debate, really, what the difference between management and leadership is. I mean, I think all managers are, in fact, leaders, yeah? I think the point is that, depending on the kind of problem, the practice of management, yeah, and the practice of leadership might be different. So it wasn't meant to be, managers are having it easy, goodness me. I think everybody in the complex settings that we're working about are really having it hard at the moment, and they are all doing leadership work. The issue is, if we go back to these different kinds of problems, I think that's where I really want to land with that. There are problems where you can manage your way out of it because you're using your expertise, yeah? Mm-hmm. But there are other problems where you can't. So I think that was so apologies if I misled you on that.
No worries. There's also, I think, especially in implementation science, I found your comments on this heroic understanding of leaders that really has dominated the field for such a long time quite interesting, because I think it is still there to a large degree, and transformational leadership probably as being one of the leadership schools of thoughts that comes with a lot of systematic reviews, a lot of evidence with it, probably reinforces that time and time again. how do you see that kind of, is that the old thing now and we're moving into distributed leadership, and where does that leave system leadership, which also is representing a bit of a school of thought? Can you kind of organize that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the challenge, I think, has been, yes, you're absolutely right. The hero leader is I think, still around. I mean, we recruit on that basis still, very often with traits, etc. So I think there is, your observation there about there's a mismatch between leadership theory and how we actually select leaders. I do think that is true. The systems leadership point, I think it could be also bucketed with this idea about adaptive leadership. They're very often used interchangeably. So what systems leadership essentially is the point about context, that we need to worry about the system and the context. And the only way of really leading in that complexity is through this adaptive, where we're experimenting more. I mean, if you look at the genetics knowledge park example that I gave you there, that's a very classic transformational, they're all going to be heroes and sort it out, yeah? Whereas actually probably a better way of leading that change might have been to be much more experimental and adaptive and think about how the system needs to be changed so that you could do these little experiments and learn from them before rolling out and giving a huge amount of money to something like that. So systems leadership and adaptive leadership are often used interchangeably. But essentially what you're making the point is that as a leader, you need to be mindful of the system and the context and adapt and maybe have this more generative leadership approach. So I would say that the scholarship has shifted from really offering us two ways of leading. One is the top-down, Kotter type approach. The other is this more generative, adaptive, systems type leadership, where experimentation and learning becomes important. And unfortunately, certainly in the UK and the NHS, I don't see much of that. Let's experiment, let's learn, let's be agile type leadership in this space. I don't know if other people do.
Good question. I'm going to look at these other people a little bit here. There are definitely two questions that relate a bit to diversity and leadership. The question to what degree you observe that female leadership is different from male leadership, but also a question about diversity, more broader diversity in leadership in general. Is that important? How can it be achieved? And diversity then also including socioeconomic background, ethnicities, those kinds of factors coming in.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, I think if we look at the complex problems that we have to try and solve, not just in our research space or the space that we're talking about, just generally, then it requires conversations with many different groups for different perspectives. So diversity has never of thought, as well as diversity of background, etc., has never become, I think, more important. How do you create, a diverse workforce, that feels psychologically safe to help leaders? Because one thing about leadership is the higher you go up in the organization, the less people will tell you what to do, and actually the less variety you get. And so the notion that diversity is not important is crazy. Diversity has never been more important as we tackle these challenging changes. So how do you build in a diverse set of colleagues that you can learn from, and different perspectives, different challenges that you need to really make sense of the problem before you act? So I think that's never been more important. Do I see a lot of efforts in relation to building diverse teams? I think organizations struggle with it. You know, we struggle with it in the business school. But it has to be high on everybody's agenda, not just because it's the right thing to do, but actually, given what I've said about the complexity of the challenges that we're facing, it's a must for leadership work. It's a must. And it's about this diversity of challenge as well as a diversity of workforce. The question about female leadership, have I noticed a difference? It's really interesting. I run a program at the business school, academic director at least, for Women Transforming Leadership, which is the only program that we have where it is just purely for women. So it's quite a controversial thing. And what's been fascinating about that work, and what I've noticed, is the extent to which many women, even though they've got positional leadership power, do not see themselves as leaders. So my whole work in that is to say, look, there are many different ways to lead. And part of it is just believing and finding your own voice, whether you're a man or a woman, about how you do it. But there are some principles that you need to understand, which I've tried to outline. But that notion of be yourself with more skill is something that's really fundamental to that program. What I've noticed in that work, and not so much in looking at healthcare leadership in these settings, but what I've noticed from that work is that the women leaders are very good at understanding the complexity of the context and the kind of emotional, but that's a stereotyping. Some men who are great at understanding that as well, but I think what I have noticed is just this lack of confidence that seems to be more prevalent in women than men in relation to how good they are.
Okay. And can we just stay there a little bit? Because you described this program, which then leads me to this topic of building leadership capacity, or work with coaching leaders, which I think in itself is it's not a revolutionary thought. It's just bizarre that we talk so much about supervision and coaching in so many other areas, but we're not doing so much about it when it comes to people getting into leadership positions and supporting them in their work. Do you have some perspectives on how to build leadership capacity over time, how organizations can do that internally with their own resources? That kind of question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, but it's interesting how the kind of coaching space has taken off, generally. I think there's several reasons for that. One is people find it very hard to find safe spaces in organizations to think things through. And so the notion of having a confidential space with somebody who's going to ask you great open questions that helps you notice things in your own environment that you may not have noticed, helps you explore options and ways forward that you may not have thought about, is something that is just so highly valued. It's kind of that safe space to think, and which says a lot about organizational life. It says a lot about what leadership is. Leadership is somehow being busy, but actually it's about reflecting. So that notion of that conversation enabling a pause in your work, so pausing isn't stopping, has become phenomenally, I think, important to leaders at every single level, or people at work at every single level. So that becomes, I think, very, very important. So that's about building kind of individual resilience and capacity, and finding the time to help somebody notice what might be in the system that they haven't seen before. But building leadership capacity, I think, fundamentally for me, is about creating contexts or cultures, organizational cultures that are psychologically safe. In other words, that people feel that they can really say what they're noticing and feeling and giving their perspective, but they're accountable. Yeah. So they're psychologically safe, but they have to be accountable. And when we have that kind of culture, you begin to get people's mindset shifting from, gosh, the work is about solving problems or making change, as opposed to the work is about learning and sharing learning and helping other people learn. So building leadership capacity in organizations is partly about the kind of work that I do at the business school, you know, sharing theory and knowledge. But probably as importantly, it's about people reflecting and almost doing a dance with the knowledge into their own practice and beginning to learn and to grow and develop themselves. But there is no doubt that we know a couple of things about what develops leadership. One is developmental relationships, what a coaching relationship or mentoring relationship would be. The other is being put into a space that's uncertain, where you have to grow. That develops leadership capacity. And then finally, the evidence is very strong on leadership capability and capacity being developed when you can work through a time where you've either been in crisis or you've made a mistake at work and somebody can help you, or you didn't get that job you wanted. So that whole working through disappointment builds leadership capability. But you can only do all of that if you have this psychologically safe, accountable space where diversity comes into that hugely in relation to developing leadership capacity, because nobody, I think, has the right answer on their own. So it was a very long answer, so apologies for that, but I think it's interesting.
It is, and it's an it's a complex answer, and the topic, psychological safety, relationship building as aspects of implementing evidence into different contexts has been a bit of a threat at this event, unintentionally probably. And could you elaborate a bit more on this? You're highlighting, yes, psychological safety to create a space where people feel safe to be vulnerable to others and use that for learning. That's important. But you then also say, but they need to be accountable. Why do you highlight that specifically? Because
if you have a psychologically safe space where there isn't any edge, it can be very cozy and comfortable. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the notion is that, you know, people have to do something with their learning, not be cozy about it. So that's the kind of getting it into practice point, I think, knowledge into practice that becomes so important. So without kind of accountability or understanding what you're there to do, it can become, you know, a kind of cozy learning, you know, a slightly, you know, nothing really changes. Equally, if you've just got accountability without psychologically safety, it can be a kind of toxic culture, which is anxiety provoking. So, you know, part of our work, I think, as leaders, is to create that sort of context where people are clear that we're there to do something, but equally we're here to kind of learn, and no one has the answer, and we should respect, etc., etc. And, you know, I often wonder about, you know, the work that I've been involved in, and this conference is really thinking about, you know, what are we noticing in terms of, you know, the kind of contexts that facilitate implementation. You know, what are we noticing about what needs to be in place for research into practice, for evidence into practice? And I think that's a really important piece of work to start really thinking about not just the barriers and facilitators, and I've done that all my career in some senses, but what needs to be in place in the system for, this aspiration, such as I gave in the example of the genetics knowledge park. People wanted that to work. They really wanted it to work, but yet it kind of was bumpy because we didn't really think enough about the container of the context. And I think that becomes important. But I think it's a really important stream of work for the community that we're engaging with now. What are we noticing about contexts and leadership practices and measurement systems that seem to facilitate, good work, good outcomes?
Okay. All right. That then triggers two more thoughts. Because in a sense, what you describe in the language, talking about contextual awareness, talking about being adaptive, talking about being reflective, almost lends itself to say there's really not like one solution to what good leadership is. So do we then really, is there a future in evidence-based management, which is, or evidence-based leadership, which is a stream of debate in itself, building leadership on evidence? Is that possible? Maybe let's begin with that. I have one more thought, but let's begin there.
Yes, I mean, in a way, I try to sort of showcase some of the evidence, in terms of the theory of leadership, that how that's changed. It's really interesting looking at leadership journeys for people, because what you notice is they may be successful in one context, but you put them in another and stuff doesn't go well. So the notion that, I would always argue that there's a lot to learn about us as a leader. You need to know what it is that your strengths are and be humble about that, and make sure you create teams that help you within that. So there is evidence around what we need to do, because we can't be good at everything, and we're all incomplete leaders. So there is evidence there, and I would say very strongly you need to think about you. We also know, if you go back to my triangle, that leadership involves followers, right? So there's evidence that we really need to understand who we're influencing, what motivates them, what scares them, what incentivizes them. The point I was making about communities of practice. Mm-hmm. So there's evidence there that's very strong that, if you don't do the work of understanding who you're trying to influence and what they will, be attentive to, then you're in trouble. There is less evidence, I think, about this whole issue about context, about what we need to do in relation to that. So I go back to the point that I guess where I'm heading to is that from where I'm sitting, that good leadership work involves, and is this evidence-based? I don't know. But it involves holding the uncertainty for long enough to understand the work. And that's hard. And there's lots of evidence that if we close it down too quickly, we have problems. Yeah. So I think in that relationship, in that sense, there's strong evidence for that, and there's strong evidence, I think, for the importance of a curiosity about this point about context and how it really is playing out. So is there one way of doing it? Is there a prescription in terms of leadership? No. Is there evidence about what we've learned? Yes. What's the job of a leader? Probably to reflect on them, the context, and the followers, and what is needed, and be skilled and modest about possibly experimentation, but mostly understand the problem that you're trying to solve, because it will require a deployment of a different kind of set of practices. And I think that becomes important as well.
And would you say that this is the same no matter what you're leading, or is the leading for evidence-based practice a bit of a different thing that comes with particular challenges or tasks or strategies?
Yeah, I mean, the wonderful thing, and I've been a great supporter of this work over many, many years, is that we know quite a lot about good evidence in clinical practice, etc. And there's always been a bit of a bump about why. So I think in a way we're on strong territory here. We've got strong territory in relation to what the problem is and understanding the problem. Yeah. But the challenge is that getting other people to believe it. Yeah. So working in a more nuanced way, because your clinicians in X might not be, have the same kind of receptivity to the evidence as your clinicians in Y. So I think it's, but I think this group, this work, is very strong because you've done the work on the problem. Yeah. The challenge is, how do you get people to adopt? And that is where the mess that I've tried to convey becomes quite important, because it's been several years since I've done that kind of work, but where good evidence just simply doesn't get used, and it's largely because of contextual issues like incentives, etc. So or people not having conversations they should. So that's been my story, is that the evidence has been strong, but it's been the implementation world, the mess that I've tried to outline here, that's become quite difficult to do.
Right. And just taking the current annoying context into account with all what you said before, so COVID-19, the pandemic, must always be an interesting, I don't know, a new wave of facilitating leadership in organizations, because it is a crisis, and people will need to work through multiple challenges. And with all the problems it brings, there's also an opportunity for building leadership through COVID. Is it a very special condition under which one is a leader currently?
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting, difficult time, but a very interesting time from that perspective. I think the leadership theory that I've outlined has more work to be done in engaging with what we've learned here, because the whole uncertainty, adaptive challenge, this is what we're talking about here. I mean, this is what it is. And what I've noticed from trying to lead in the business school is that the range of problems that I outlined, the kind of critical problem, we need to get everybody out. I mean, I've noticed all those problems, but in steady state, of course, what we're all noticing, I think, is how our private and our professional lives have become very much more intertwined. I think I know my colleagues far better than I did a year ago, because they've seen my kids coming behind me and the dog and all the rest of it. So there's a kind of interesting change in relationships. One's had to expose vulnerabilities as you've gone through this, so there's been an interesting sort of honesty that in my work with other colleagues that has been very, I think, interesting and very human. And I hope that we can nurse some of that when we come back. I think the other thing that you have noticed in this period is where the strains are in the organization. What's not working has become very evident. So the chances of of really trying to solve some of those structural or incentive problems, I think we need to be really, what have we noticed about what's gone well and what hasn't gone well? And then, of course, the nature of work has changed. I can't imagine, that we're going to go back to, an expectation of being in the office and all the rest of it. So there's going to be an awful lot of, remote leadership work. I think the thing I found much harder in doing leadership work in this environment is, the difficult conversations that require emotional, sort of nudging. So any difficult conversation I have had, I've never done it on Zoom. I've done it on the phone because I just think it's very difficult. So yes, there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done, I think, on what we've learned for leadership, implementation and change work in the last year. And I hope that agenda is starting now. But certainly a huge change. And, the tiredness and the concerns that I have about people's resilience and the expectations we've got on them, particularly in our context, healthcare context that you're studying, is going to be quite challenging. And I think as researchers, we need to be mindful of that as we are in our own lives.
Interesting. And you're almost implicitly recommending to reflect on what has changed leadership-wise and reflect on how to probably sustain the good bits.
No, absolutely. And I think we'd be rather foolish. I mean, there is a danger, as you know, of people falling back into bad habits, but, to pause and reflect and to learn. And I hope that is also true in not just university contexts that I work in, but the healthcare context that we're so passionate about supporting.
Great. All right. I'm aware of time. This is bringing us to the end of this session. Thanks heaps for your active participation. Thank you again, Sue, for a fascinating presentation and thoughts. I hope everyone got inspired by this session at a very concrete level, maybe to make an evidence-informed change in your own work as leaders. The EIS will continue, so please dive into some of the fabulous content available online. We will meet live again later this afternoon. An exciting block of content awaiting for you, focused on the use of common elements, the active ingredients of programs and practices used in human services are the focus. Bruce Tropida from the University of California will speak first, followed by an expert panel chaired by Renat Baders, and then including Alicia Clark from the Early Intervention Foundation, together with our own Jane Lewis, Patty Leiden from Leiden University, and Professor Bryce McLeod from Virginia Commonwealth University. So absolutely not to be missed that session if you have an interest for this alternative approach to designing effective practice. Until then, thanks to everyone. Thanks again to Sue. Please stay healthy and safe, and goodbye.
Thank you. Good luck. Thanks very much indeed. Love the conversation. Thank you.